This video will be part 1 of Chapter 5, covering legal and forensic psychology for PSY 120, Careers in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Human Development. What I spend a lot of my time doing in this chapter is kind of debunking myths about the work that psychologists do within the legal system. And a lot of this has to do with popular culture images of psychologists and psychiatrists who are involved in the criminal justice system, typically as this almost mythically unicorn figure of the profiler. So we need to spend some time debunking some of those ideas and also exploring more accurate and actually available career paths within these areas. Now, before I get started, you will notice that I've gone slightly out of order from the chapters in your textbook. The last chapter that I covered was on clinical and counseling psychology. Now I've jumped over to chapter 5 to look at legal and forensic. The reason I chose to do that is because most people who work in the forensic area within psychology, and even those who work as police psychologists, who are basically providing services to police officers and others in law enforcement, and those who work in corrections are almost exclusively trained in clinical and counseling psychology as well. So you can think of forensic psychology, for example, as a specialty within the field of clinical psychology, because that's typically where those individuals work. So to start, let's get some definitions on the table. When we think about psychology generally, we're talking, especially in the applied areas, we're talking about using psychology to help people understand themselves and to improve their functioning. The law, if you think about it very broadly and in a very general sense, is designed to create rules within cultures that are appropriate to their cultural values and standards so that people can live together without harming each other or damaging each other's property. Legal psychology, sometimes called psychology in the law, and when I went to graduate school, I was actually very interested in this area of research. I was interested in people's attitudes, beliefs, and values related to the legal system. So I was kind of allied to this, and I was able to do my graduate degrees at the University of Nebraska, which has very comprehensive programming in psychology and law. Basically, what the field of psychology and law does is combine these two areas of interest, and they are very, very different. Taking classes in law schools, it's a very different environment, a different mindset compared to taking coursework in psychology, which is a scientific discipline that really plays in the area of what if, and it depends. In the law, there's very little it depends. So merging these disciplines is often challenging, but fascinating as well. Forensic psychology, as I mentioned, is a narrow area of specialization within clinical psychology that plays a vital role within the legal system. Profiling, as I mentioned in my brief introduction, is a really rare activity, and contrary to what's presented in the popular media, people who do criminal profiling are almost never actually trained psychologists. In shows like Criminal Minds, you're presented with people who appear to have psychology degrees or occasionally neuroscience degrees, frequently being a psychiatrist, which is a medical doctor with a clinical specialty in psychology, working with police to provide profiles of criminals, which are often, they often sound more like magical fortune telling than actual scientific work. That's not what criminal profilers do. Profiling is almost always work completed by career law enforcement people. Formal criminal profiling is work that is done almost exclusively within the context of the FBI. Some large police departments in localities have individuals who typically are long-term career detectives who do the activity of profiling within their law enforcement agencies, but kind of put away that notion that there is a career path for psychologists doing criminal profiling. There are a handful of individuals working through the FBI over the decades who are cross-trained in law enforcement and also have a background and a history of training in psychology. But again, their route to performing the activities of profiling is almost always through being a career law enforcement agent, if it's with the FBI, or an officer or detective, if it's within the police force. Forensic psychologists, in contrast, are people who typically have training either at the master's or doctoral level in clinical or counseling psychology. If you look at graduate programs, and I'll talk more about this in the second half of the presentation, most of these individuals are going to be in the clinical area. Forensic psychology involves a lot of testing, assessment, testifying in court, performing evaluations, and then presenting that information to law enforcement or to the judicial system. In some cases, these are individuals who are in private practice. Sometimes they are employed through the criminal justice system. Frequently, these are people who have a multi-layered practice. They may be practicing clinical psychologists who also provide forensic services. So we'll talk more about that as we move through the presentation. But I want to back up now and talk about, if you have interest in this intersection between psychology and law, and I have many students who are double majors or who are minoring in criminal justice. So that's typically a student who has an interest in this intersection area of law and psychology. So what are some of the bachelor's level opportunities if you want to take that interest and then go directly into the workforce after completing your college education? One obvious choice is doing police work. And there are lots of opportunities for people to work in this area at the level of the local, so sheriff's departments, city police forces, and so on. Also at the state level and the federal level, although at the state and federal level, you're significantly more likely to be required to have a graduate degree to move into that kind of position. However, it's very commonplace for the federal agencies like the FBI and the Border Patrol to actually recruit on college campuses to bring in young people who are interested in this intersection between law and psychology to work in their agencies. We've routinely on our campus had representatives from the FBI, from Border Patrol, somewhat less often from other agencies doing that recruiting. Police work involves being responsible for protecting and serving the people in your jurisdiction. At its basic level, you have uniformed officers who respond to calls, deal with traffic, investigate crimes, provide first aid, and so on. As people can climb the ranks, there are different positions that people can hold within the police force that have different job requirements and different specific work activities. So it bears exploration as to what you're interested in and what you want to do as a police officer. It is a challenging career path. It can be very rewarding. It can be very stressful, like a lot of career paths. Unlike a lot of other career paths, it can be dangerous. Interactions with people who are breaking the law can put you at risk of dangerous interactions. So my recommendation to students who are interested in police work is that they do some interning. We've had many students who intern at the Alliance Police Department, a handful over the years that I've been teaching. who did intern work at their local police, um, their local police departments, or with the sheriff's department. So I highly recommend that, so that you get some embedded experience of what the day-to-day job is like. Another bachelor's opportunity where there are lots of jobs available is in corrections. Working in correctional facilities, i.e., jails and prisons, is work that is necessary. You're basically the frontline person who has the most day-to-day interaction with people who are incarcerated. Sometimes these are people who are incarcerated for short periods of time. Others, they're incarcerated for very, very long periods of time, sometimes on life sentences or even death sentences. There are lots of different kinds of correctional facilities. You can have your local sheriff's jail. You can have city-run jails. You can have regional correctional facilities, some of which are state-run, some of which are privatized. There's also federal corrections institutions, as well as military ones. So there are lots of different opportunities for people to engage in this sort of frontline activity. The psychology side of it is corrections officers, since they have all of this day-to-day responsibility, working with people who are incarcerated, they may have to engage a great deal in acts like conflict resolution, understanding people who are experiencing stress, trauma, and who are frequently struggling with mental health problems. So the corrections officers who get to know these people, especially if they are long-term inmates who are serving long sentences, they may be the person who that inmate has the most contact with who isn't another inmate. So they know them well, they have long-term relationships with them, and often know best what some of their challenges and difficulties are. So they play a critical role in the work of inmate care, but also prevention of problems within prison and jail settings. And many would argue that they play a critical role in rehabilitation. So these interpersonal skills that we emphasize in majors in our programs are heavily utilized by people working in this sphere. Another area that I've had many graduates, many advisees over the years interested in is working with young people who have been adjudicated with crimes. So juveniles, I did an internship when I was in your position as an undergraduate, working with kids who had committed very adult-like crimes. So these were kids who were charged with felonies of various kinds. And I was part of an intensive probation program. What I learned very quickly was that 99.9% of these kids had been exposed to trauma. They had very difficult life circumstances. They had histories of abuse and neglect. They had histories of displacement, sometimes being homeless, difficulties in school, difficulties with peers, all kinds of psychological problems. So one bachelor's level option for people with these interests is to work directly with juveniles as detention workers. So basically, these are corrections officers of a sort who work in juvenile facilities, specifically for kids. These workers have the same responsibilities, therefore, as people working in corrections in any other setting, and the same kind of impacts. So, the detention workers are the ones that these kids have the most day-to-day contact with, and who are going to know what these kids need, what they're struggling with, what their problems are. Now, for both corrections work and detention work, whether you're working with adults or kids, detention work and corrections, it can be a dangerous job. It can be a physically stressful job, a very challenging job. So you should go into it with your eyes open, understanding the nature of the work. Again, I would recommend, as an undergraduate, if you're thinking about these career paths, that you do some internship or shadowing, or at the very least, take a visit where you can talk to people who are working in this field directly about their experiences. Another option, and I have a couple of graduates over the years who've worked in this area, is working in probation and parole. So these are individuals who work with people who have been in the criminal justice system, but they're not currently living in jails and prisons. So they're either on probation or they're on parole, and they have to do check-ins and work with their probation or parole officer to ensure that they're compliant with the terms of their release of either their probation or their parole. So in some cases, this involves supervising people out in the community, meeting with them daily or weekly to make sure that they're not violating their parole. For example, there may be a stipulation in their terms where they can't have interactions with people who are engaged in criminal activity. So the parole or probation officer will do check-ins to make sure that the person is not engaging with those people. There may be a stipulation that they have to submit to random drug and alcohol testing, typically drug testing. So they may have to pop in, collect a urine sample, and do that testing. They also talk to people who are on probation or parole about their goals, about their needs, working with connecting them with resources, such as treatment for substance use disorder, helping them to identify resources for housing and employment. And those are very important roles for these individuals to play. So what you're seeing here with the probation and parole officers is part of the work is very much supervision of people who have broken the law to make sure that they're compliant legally. So it's a hybrid kind of law enforcement position. In some jurisdictions, these individuals carry a sidearm and have the ability to use those sidearms if they are threatened. But they're also performing sort of pseudo-social work functions of having direct contact with individuals who are attempting to stay out of the criminal justice system, or at least stay unincarcerated. These activities it's beneficial if you have a good understanding of human behavior and the needs that people have. Most people, the overwhelming majority of people who come into contact with the criminal justice system, have some kind of experience or some sort of mental health condition that benefits from therapeutic services, and as well as having medical needs that are often unmet in that population. So having someone who's able to connect you with resources is invaluable. Another bachelor's level activity that is, relatively speaking, a newer kind of career path is something called a forensic interviewer. So these are individuals who have specialized training. Usually it's training in context, so getting the work, getting the job, and then becoming proficient at the work of interviewing. Sometimes forensic interviewers are hired because they have developed a specialty after they have a professional degree, like a graduate degree in another area, say counseling or clinical psychology or even forensic psychology. But some individuals move into forensic interviewing pretty directly. So these are individuals who work with people who have had offenses committed against them, so victims of crime, and they learn to engage in what are called structured interviews to get information about criminal events. And this is a very important task because what you get out of these interviews is detailed information. If the interviews are conducted properly and carefully, that can be useful to the prosecution in securing convictions. So, for example, if you have a child who's a witness of a violent offense, it's important to have a professional person who comes in, who understands how to interview children, and will ask questions and get answers to them without leading the child, without getting them, kind of caught up in imagination or trying to please you as the question asker. So, knowing a bit about development and emotional capacity and an understanding of trauma can make you a very good forensic interviewer. Forensic interviews, as a result, they require a really solid understanding of interpersonal interaction. Psychology background is really helpful for that. Not all people who work as forensic interviewers have a bachelor's degree, and from what I've heard in recent years, it's becoming more and more professionalized. There are individuals who are already police officers, typically detectives, who get some additional training as interviewers. Others are uniformed officers and they get additional training as interviewers. Other people are individuals who work kind of allied to the police department. So they're hired on a contract basis to come in and do interviewing work. Some of these are individuals who specialize in working with victims of sexual crimes, for example, or working with kids. So that concludes my coverage of the first half of Chapter 5.